Hello, good to see all of you here in this wonderful library. Our today's lecture is called Extractive Industries and Indigenous Peoples in Western Siberia Between Dialogue and Conflict. And the first thing I have to explain is this thick red line you see on screen. It's called the Russian sector of the Arctic. You can see that the Russian sector is rather huge. It's almost 45% of the whole Arctic. And that's why it's pretty important to know what's going on in the area. There are two speakers and two parts of the talk today. Except myself, Nikolai Vakhtin, I'm head of Center for Arctic Social Studies at the European University, St. Petersburg. And Dr. Stephan Dudeck, he has numerous affiliations, but he's also affiliated with the European University, although due to the epidemics, the COVID epidemics, he's at present affiliated unofficially. Our talk today will consist of two parts. A shorter part, mine, will be about 25 minutes. It will be a general introduction about the Arctic, the Russian Arctic, what is it, where is it, and so on. And the main part of the lecture will be given by Stephan, and it will be twice as long. Okay. So I have no idea how much you know about the Russian Arctic or the far north or northern Siberia. By default, I assume that you don't know much, so I will begin at the beginning. What do people know, the general public? What does the general public know about the Arctic, the North, Siberia? Well, the first thing they know, that everybody knows this, is that it's very cold there. Here are some nice pictures from the Russian Arctic, and I especially like the one on the lower right, where a gloved hand is holding a piece of paper with minus 59 centigrade next to a thermometer. And minus 59 centigrade, for those of you who are accustomed to other scales, is approximately minus 58 Fahrenheit. The big problem of the area is not that it's just cold. It's not just weather. It's also what we call permafrost. You can see on the screen the map of permafrost of Russia. And permafrost is the situation when the soil is frozen through either around the year or seasonally in winter. And you can see on this map, the darker green area shows the areas where permafrost is permanent. The lighter green, grayish and brownish, respectively, when the permafrost is seasonal, shorter, and brownish where it is not. So you can see that in this huge area of the Russian Arctic, no agriculture is possible because the soil is frozen. So the big question is, how could it happen that Russia acquired such inhospitable lands? How, when, and why the Russians, who had lived in a much warmer environment, of course, and who has always been, at least until mid-20th century, they were agricultural people, they were peasants mostly, why did they move up northeast into the land that was not, where agriculture was not possible? First of all, let me speak about how they moved and when. The dark green is the Russian territory in 1547. You can see that a small portion of Western Siberia is already under Russian rule. 1605 is the next lighter green, yellowish is 1689, and so on, until by the earliest 18th century, the Russians arrived to the Kamchatka Peninsula. You can see that this colonization was rather steady and rather fast. How did it go? There were two routes, by sea and by land. The first, the sea colonization, moved along the shores of the Arctic Ocean. People moved by, sailed by small wooden ships, actually boats, from the mouth of one river to the mouth of the next. In each place they would establish a wooden fort, which became center of control over the local population, the center of trade, the center of tax collections, the center for suppression of rebels, which were numerous. And then next year, or after a couple of years, a party would move further east and again will build a fort, and the story would repeat. And the second route was by land, through the town of Ustюг, through what is today Yugra in northwestern Siberia. Already in the 13th century, the territory officially belonged to Novgorod Republic. The way of moving east was more or less the same. Forts were built, trade, taxation, then a party would move further east, and so on and so forth. What is amazing is the speed of this colonization. The speed was very high. You can see on this slide that in 1586, the first Siberian town was founded, the town of Tyumen, and by 1648, Semyon Dezhnev, a Cossack, with his team, with his company, sailed around Chukotka, went upstream another river and established a fort there. He sailed through what would be later known as Bering Strait. You can see that in 62 years, the Russians moving eastwards covered 50 to 100 kilometers as bird flies. But they were not flying, they were moving through a very unfriendly and very hard terrain. The problem is how to call this. I have chosen the word colonization because to my ear, I may be wrong, to my ear, the English word sounds the most neutral, and I need a neutral word here. Because, of course, the choice of the word is political, ideological, and you can find in popular or academic literature anything. You can find conquest, colonization, appropriation, development, annexation, incorporation, migration even. Expansion is a very popular word. So the way you call it immediately shows shows your attitude to the process. Okay. It looks like many Russian artists of the 19th and 20th century saw this process as a military conquest, at least on the famous picture by Vasily Surikov called Conquest of Siberia by Yermakets, 6 by 3 meters hanging in the Russian Museum here. And if you haven't seen it, it's a must. It's a beautiful picture. It has nothing to do with the reality, of course, but still it's very beautiful. I think there were such battles, especially at the earlier stages of the conquest, but there were not many, and there is no date. The official date of conquest of Siberia is 1585. As the date of the first attempt of Yermak, head of a rebellious Cossack company, rather furious, I should say, to enter into Western Siberia. It was the first but not the last, and not very successful. And there were attempts before that and attempts many years after that. So there's no specific date of this conquest. There's a certain differences between Russian colonization of Siberia and, let's say, British colonization of North America, or American colonization of the Wild West, and so on. There are many people who call this Russian colonization internal colonization. I'll just give you one quotation here from Vasily Kluchevsky, who's a famous historian, and he wrote in the early 20th century, Russian history is a history of the country that colonized itself. The colonized area expanded together with the territory of the state. That's a very strong claim. There's a nice book called, in Russian, I think it's translated now into English, by Alexander Etkind, called Internal Colonization. There are two meanings of the term colonization. The first is clear. It's smooth, seamless expansion, uninterrupted by seas. The Russians didn't have to cross any sea, only rivers. But the second meaning of the colonization, this term describes the relations between the elite, that's the government or the educated classes, to its population, and the other way around, the attitude of the population towards its government. The center regards the whole territory of the country as a colony, as a wild and savage country that needs cultivating, and sees its mission in bringing culture and civilization to its own people. And this is the second meaning of the term internal colonization. And of course, both can be applied to Siberia. It is an uninterrupted continuation of the territory of the European part of Siberia. Here are some pictures from Tumen area. Let me remind you that Tumen was the first Siberian city established, Siberian fort, first town later, established by the Russians. If you look at those pictures, honestly, when I got into the area, I couldn't find any difference between this and the nature of central northern Russia. It's the same land, the same rivers, the same birch forests, the same winter, the same hills, and the same churches. It's exactly the same. It's a continuation of the land. And the second meaning of internal colonization is that Siberian population was and has been always considered not civilized enough. Both the indigenous people and the Russians who had settled there. And, well, I think Stephan will touch on that. What is important here? Although we call this colonization internal, Siberia and the far north have always been real colonies, with all features of a colony, with political dependence, with economic exploitation of natural resources, of the local labor that worked in the interests of the metropolises. The local population was regarded as second-rate human beings compared with those who lived in the western part of the country. Today, however, many consider Siberia a natural part of Russia because the colony is very old. Okay, that's how, and now why. The aim of this colonization. Why did the agricultural country needed an extension into the area where agriculture was not possible? Of course, it was the natural resources. In the earlier times, these were the resources, the main resources. The most popular was, of course, the sable, then the Arctic fox, the beaver, the red fox, and the squirrel. And this was something that the people were very much after. They wanted as much of that as possible. The situation has not changed since, actually. The resources has, but the attitude has not. Here are the resources today. It's coal, it's diamonds, it's gold, it's oil and gas. We see the same idea that that Russia needs these territories in order to extract resources from it. And it's not joking, because in the 17th century, the export of pelts constituted up to 13% of the annual revenue of the Russian state. 13%. Today, the export of natural gas amounts to 12.6%. It's approximately the same figure. Oil is more, of course. If you add oil, it's more. Okay, a couple of words about the area. What is North and what is Arctic or Siberia? There is no objective definition of the area, and this is important. There is no definition that would suit us for all purposes and all times. The far north is a legal concept in Russia, defined by a list of regions. Today, this is how it looks. The reddish, pinkish areas is those that are considered far north. I especially love this one, down here. And the greenish areas are those equated to the areas of the far north, where the economic privileges are approximately the same. So you can see that the only way you can define the far north is by drawing a map, by writing all those names and marking all those territories. There isn't much that unites these things. It's an old concept. It was developed in mid-20th century. And a more recent concept, the concept of the Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, was introduced in 2014. Oops. What did I do? Sorry. The Arctic zone of the Russian Federation. I'm sorry, the map is in Russian, but I couldn't find an English one. Again, you can see that the definition of this Arctic zone is again by simple listing the areas. Because there are certain economic advantages provided to the regions of this Arctic zone, many local governors began, as soon as the law was passed, began to lobby inclusion of their own areas into the Arctic zone. And many succeeded. There were two amendments to this law of 2014, one in 2017 and the other in 2019. And in all probability, this is not the end of the road. I'll show you just one picture of how these amendments look in Yakutia. So these areas up there, the light blue ones, were in the 2014 law. And these areas here, the darker blue, not blue, what's the color? I'm not sure. These were added in 2019. So you can see that as soon as there is an economic advantage, people want to become far north, they want to become Arctic. Okay, a couple of words about the population. Who, where, and how much? I will not go into this in any detail, but still, when the Russians first came to the area, it was populated by indigenous people, but those who had been there since time immemorial. Archaeology shows that people lived in southern Siberia as long ago as 30,000 years. And in northern Siberia as long ago as 12,000 years. But gradually, with the advent of Russians to the area, The situation changed because we now have not only indigenous people, but also local people, those descendants of Russian settlers who came to the area 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 400 years ago. Their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren still live in the area. And by all indications, they are very often indistinguishable from indigenous population. With one exception, indigenous population is a legal term in Russia. There is a law describing who is indigenous and who is not indigenous. Yeah, also to list it briefly, shift workers, newcomers who came there to work for a short period of time, the military, of course, the immigrants from other countries, and so on and so forth. So what is important that the population of the Arctic today is very diverse. The overall number of people who permanently live in the Russian Arctic is approximately 2.5 million people. That's a lot. And up to 7% of those are indigenous people. Okay, in order to be considered indigenous, a certain group must live on the traditional land of their ancestors. It must retain traditional way of life. It must perceive themselves as a community, and it must number less than 50,000 people. So this is a legal description of who is indigenous and who is not. But you can see immediately when you look at these 4 points that except for the numbers, none of the 4 can be independently assessed. What is traditional way of life? How far into time we should dig to find tradition. In order to solve this legal problem, the Russian government went along a familiar road. They invented a list of traditional ways of life. It's a legal document. Okay. The second question, of course, is a Nenets person, for instance, in Western Siberia, who decided to move from a reindeer herd into a town and become, I don't know, a shop attendant or a driver or a doctor, for that matter. Is this person indigenous? Continues to be indigenous? No answer. We don't know. Because indigenous is traditional way of life. Okay. How do we know how these people perceive themselves? We know that perception is a very shaky ground. We are not sure how we perceive ourselves very, very often. Say nothing about people who live in those tents. They would say, if there is an economic advantage, they'll say, no, we are not Nenets. If there is an opposite advantage, they'll say, yes, we are Nenets. And there are lots of examples all over the north when people, from census to census, you can see sudden growth of a certain ethnic group or a sudden decline of that group because it has become advantageous to be indigenous or it has stopped advantageous to be indigenous. Again, traditional territory. You'll laugh, of course, but there's a legal document, a list of traditional territories, because there is no other way to solve the problem. And I'm sure that Stephan will speak more about territories in his part of the lecture. Okay, so the conclusion of my introductory part, and here are some conclusions. Siberia and the far north were, from the start, Russian colonies. This was internal colonization, but still a colonization. The far north, the Arctic, has always had a population. It never was a barren land or a frozen desert. Approximately around mid-1950s, there was a drastic increase of the Russian population. Why I write Russian in quotation marks, because it was, of course, not only the ethnic Russian population, but the population of all of the former Soviet Union, from all parts of the Soviet Union. They were called newcomers, and was a really drastic increase, 10 times, 20 times in many areas. The reason to go up north was mostly economic, extraction of resources, of all sorts of resources. In 1990s, dramatic decrease of the newcomers, also for economic reasons. The Soviet economic system went down the drain, and it was a very hard time for people who lived there. Today, the situation is politically different, but economically rather similar. And now, as my last slide, I offer you a small spoiler for Stephan's part of the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nikolai. I think I will just go ahead straight away, and we will move now, so to speak, from the global picture to a more concrete regional one. I will speak here about a region that I'm most familiar with located in the Western Siberian plain, and concretely about one group of the indigenous people officially recognized in that list that Nikolai mentioned are, if I'm not wrong, 46 of them in the Russian north. They have to be less than 50,000. And the Khanty living in Western Siberia are one of them. They speak a Finno-Ugrian language related to other Finno-Ugrian one, especially to the Mansi language and the Hungarian language, the most closest linguistic relatives of the Hungarians, quite far away. But that's a historical question that we will not touch upon here in this lecture. But I will focus not on all this kind of ethnographic stuff that I'm usually speaking about, not about the history, not about the culture, not about the religion. I will speak here about the conditions of their life under industrialization, which started, of course, in the last century, in the 20th century. But they have roots, as Nikolai mentioned, in the history of colonization, in the history of the Russian state, expanding to the east, and being interested in the wealth of these territories. Of course, not only the state, but who are these people who are interested in the resources? They are entrepreneurs, they are traders, and today, of course, these are industrial companies, some of them integrated internationally, multinational companies, also companies that we all know. When we go drive cars to the next fuel station, we read there Surgutneftegas, LUKOIL, Rosneft, you know them all. But I will speak about the relationship of local people living there where these resources are extracted that end up in the fuel tanks of cars all over the world. And in this case, the Khanty people who are used, and you can see here some of them on the famous day of the reindeer herder in one of the maybe it's even Kogalem, one of the oil towns that were established in the 60s in the region. But this just as a short impression. What I now want you like to introduce to is a kind of moving down from a satellite image, so to speak, from above. I use Google Map here, satellite images, and we will now go to that city of Kogalem, which actually, if you remember, the second biggest player in the oil business in Russia is the company LUKOIL, and their first three letters, LUK, the third of them comes actually from the town of Kogalem, which was founded at the end of the 60s. I think it got city rights in the 80s. It's a very young city. And here you see the next, now we move down to the city of Kogalem, and you can see very clearly, you see how the city is built. Interestingly, on the right side, you see the industrial part of the city. that was where the city started. It was along a railway that was built up, coming from Surgut, from the south, from Tyumen, going north to the gas fields in the Yamal areas north. And there, where these oil fields were discovered in the 60s, this town emerged first with industrial constructions on the railroad. Then the city, the kind of building blocks, the housing complexes in the upper left corner. And then interestingly, and that's very specific for Russia, I think, down there on the lower side, you see the dacha area, the summer houses. Of course, they are not only used in summer for recreation. And with the same scale, now you see like you saw the footprint of a city in the landscape. Now you see the footprint of an oil field in the landscape. It's the same scale. And here you see a very typical way of oil fields expanding into the landscape, the so-called branch method of developing oil fields. It's like a tree. There are roads going into the landscape, and then there are branches reaching out from the main road, so the drilling places can be reached. So this is not snow, as some people told me when they watched and when they saw this. You see here actually rivers, lakes, and swamps, a very water-rich landscape, mostly swampy areas. And in order to move on that, dams should be established by just putting sand into the landscape. The sand is digged usually along sandy places along these rivers that you see on the left and on the right side, and then put to the swamps so the heavy machinery can go and drill and establish the drilling places. And now you see the same scale. That's the territory of a local reindeer herder and hunter. Actually, you don't see anything because it's so small that you cannot detect. I don't know if there's there's no pointer here, right? Or is there? No, there's a pointer. Up in the very left corner, here you would see a winter settlement, and somewhere here in the middle, there would be the summer settlement. So there are seasonal settlements. I will speak about these settlements a little bit further. And now we move in, like you saw, I pointed to the very left corner, upper left corner, and now you see the winter settlement actually of that family. There are a few houses here. I try again to use the pointer. Here there are a few houses you can, I don't know how good your eyes are. Here you see the corral. That's a kind of fence for the reindeer herd. A small reindeer herd of maybe a little bit than 100 reindeer. And then, of course, fishing places and hunting places around. And now this is the footprint, so to speak, of a reindeer hunting settlement, reindeer herders settlement in these taiga areas. And now you see the footprint of an oil drilling, the same scale as this settlement. You see the end of one of these branches on the oil field, and you can of course compare what kind of impact that has on the environment. It's easy to understand that, of course, in the proximity of these oil fields, reindeer herding is almost not possible. The surface is destroyed. It's dangerous for the reindeer to run on these sandy places because there's heavy machinery. And you see also the dark color around the oil, exactly the oil pumps which are established there, together with the drilling of the oil that comes somehow. Drilling mud gets up that is stored next to the places, and that's of course water mixed up with oil, which is not very healthy for the reindeer as well. Here you see a kind of aerial picture of such a drilling place, and you see this storage facility just next to the drilling place where the oil mud is stored. There's of course a problem to keep this storage facilities sealed, so the oil water mixture is not going out to the landscape, because you can easily understand that oil is lighter than water, and these areas are flooded regularly. If the oil is expanding beyond these drilling places, then it's usually polluting a vast territory. Another problem, ecological problem, but also affecting the local population, of course, the reindeer herders, but not only them, city dwellers as well, is the flaming of gas that comes together with the oil. So when you drill into an oil deposit, there's always gas mixed up. There's the gas fraction in the deposit. That is a kind of low quality natural gas, which is usually not very much used and flamed. Of course, due to regulations, especially like 10 years ago around, finally, there was new legislation established in Russia that tried to limit these kind of flaming because, of course, as you see here, it's producing a lot of pollution, air pollution. Another problem that you all know, maybe from the press and from regular reports, and one of the main, of course, ecological problems of oil industry are leakages of oil into the environment because of the age of the infrastructure that is used due to reducing costs, of course. It's a question of costs at the end. What is more costly, to deal with the damage, with the pollution, or to repair or to use to repair and to rebuild the pipelines and the infrastructure. And so if there's no or not sufficient legislation and not sufficient like material incentives for the oil companies to prevent these kind of damages, of course, they use the infrastructure up to the very end, which of course causes a lot of, so to speak, not material costs, but social costs, because the oil companies risk to lose what we call the social license, the kind of the agreement of the local population, not only the indigenous ones, the reindeer herders, but also other people living there because their water is polluted as well. Their agreement, the legitimacy of the companies to exist at all, they are attacked by the press, if there is a press, and of course get under pressure of public opinion. Of course, a new emerging theme in this field is the question of climate change. That is actually an advertisement of LUKOIL that is already 10 years ago, when obviously LUKOIL was not yet aware of the discourse of climate change. At least it seems so, because they were proudly announcing that they are the ones who provide energy and warming up the world, so to speak, the earth. Of course, I think nowadays maybe the managers and advertising companies have changed already their strategies, but that's how the companies see themselves. And of course, 10 years ago, this was working very well still with the public, at least there in the region. But now I will move away from this was just an introduction to let you know what oil drilling actually means and what it means for the environment and for the people living there, and how this relates the kind of ecological footprint of the whole business. Now you see another way of depicting this kind of footprint, but you see also the footprint again of the reindeer herders, because what you see here as green areas, this is the Khanty-Mansiyski Autonomous Okrug. This is the kind of administrative unit. And you see with green, these are the territories allotted to the reindeer herding family, so-called Radavoye Ugodje, or roughly translated into English, family or clan lands or clan territories. And with blue color, you see the licensed territories to the oil companies. And you see that in more than half of the cases, they overlap almost completely. So almost all of the territories of the reindeer herders are there, where are at the same territories where there's oil production licensed. There's also white spaces, and of course you could ask themselves, who's living there? Are they empty? Is there nobody living? And this is an interesting question, because it points to the fact that, of course, this is not the case. There are also reindeer herders and hunters living there, but they didn't manage in the 90s to get their territories licensed because there were no, or they forgot partly because there was no conflict with the oil company. There was no need because they were living there forever. They never had any kind of papers on their land. They were living on the land, used it. Some, of course, during the Soviet time, there were state enterprises and collective enterprises, kolkhozes, as you might know, but there was no need. yeah, this is actually this very city center of Kogalem. I mentioned already this capital of LUKOIL, and there's a nice monument which is called very symbolically the drop of life. And you can of course imagine what the drop of life in this region means. It's of course a drop of oil, because the whole region and the whole economy, but not only the economy, also the political system is dependent on the oil industry. It's a single economy dependent region. And here you see that the artists also depicted the indigenous people included symbolically into that so-called drop of life. Of course, we can imagine that they don't see it so much as a drop of life, but they very well know their dependency on these economy as well. But yeah, to give you an impression of these cities, this is a quite old actually picture, but it didn't change much, of Surgut, one of the other big cities there. And in comparison, I like these kind of contrasts. Here you see a reindeer herder settlement, family settlement containing of 2 houses for 2 families. And actually everything there is built by the people by people themselves. So they really can feel themselves masters on their own land. They build their houses. They build the sledges that are pulled by the reindeer. But of course, they have also modern technology. They use snowmobiles. They get fuel from the oil companies. And I have to tell, of course. And now I come to the actually theme of our lecture, to the relationship of the oil companies and local people. How actually are they interacting? And we kind of we put into opposition at the title of our lecture the question of dialogue or conflict. And of course, we have to say that this is not an opposition. Conflict is also a form of dialogue. All kinds of interactions are all these kind of relationships are forms of interaction, and they always are kind of dealing with each other, which can grow into conflict, but which can also be of mutual benefit. And the way how in which direction it develops, that's actually the big question. But I will first introduce you to the concrete issues that are that people deal with. I spoke already about the damage. And of course, this is perceived as a negative impact on the land of the reindeer herders and fishers. They can actually, when they want to herd their reindeer there, they have less territories. When they want to go fishing, they have less waterways because they are crossed by the roads. They are polluted by the oil. So they have actually something that they want compensation for, and they get partly this kind of compensation through, first of all, I mentioned the right on the territories that they have. They have a paper which says, I'm living here. And secondly, they get that to something that was established in the local legislation, which is called economic agreements, that they have to, or they are able to agree with the oil company that is working on their land. Through this, I have still on that picture, through this economic agreements, they are granted a certain amount of fuel, they are granted a certain amount of building materials, they are granted a certain amount of money, they are granted a certain amount of helicopter flights. For instance, if a family member has to go to the hospital. It's a long list of certain things that the family get. I will speak about that in a few minutes again, but I just some pictures to show you like reindeer herding like it looks today. And the reindeer is, of course, not only, as we all might imagine, something to eat, an animal that you can slaughter like a pig or a cow. It's also a mean of transportation, as you see here, but you see also it provides clothing. And if somebody of you have seen pictures of the tents that the reindeer nomads live in, it's also providing housing. And it's also, and that's something maybe not so obvious, it's also a cultural value. You can offer the reindeer as a gift to the gods that you venerate, and it's a symbol of the culture also to the outside world. But this is a picture, so to speak, to emphasize the importance of fishing That's a very specific part of fishing, a specific technique of fishing, tradition of fishing, by closing up the rivers with fish wires and then putting these big fish traps that you see here. That's a technique actually that was spread all over the north. Also some 100 years ago, fishermen here in the surroundings of St. Petersburg were using very similar fishing techniques. But back to the oil boom of the 70s and a little bit to the history of the development of the oil industry, which led, already I mentioned that it started in the 60s, it expanded in the 70s, and we know from the global economy that this kind of extractive industries, they experience boom and bust circles. So if the economy is booming, industry is developing, they are acquiring new territories and new oil fields. When the prices go down, when there's a lot of supply, the prices go down, the economies might shut down, or the oil deposits get exhausted. So the companies are all the time, or the industries are all the time kind of expanding and then shrinking again and expanding again, which poses, of course, a big problem to the population also, because people usually experience problem, especially through the bust circles. During the boom circles, everything is expanding, and there are, of course, these problems that we saw with the ecology and with pollution and so on. But during the bust circles, when the industry is actually going away, shrinking, other problems appear. And that happened to the agricultural industry, or the agricultural branch of the economy already in the 70s. During the Soviet Union, the local fish factories closed down, the local kolkhozes became not important anymore, or not self-sufficient anymore. Partly, they were supported by the oil companies. There was something that was called in Russian chefstvo, a kind of sponsoring of the local population by the big industries already in the Soviet Union. And there was a sedentarization program that started already in the 30s, but was taking force in the 50s, that actually was given up due to the fact that the local population in this boom circle, in this boom phase in the 70s and 80s, were not important anymore. So the whole kind of colonization process directed towards integration of the local population into the Soviet state was like not important anymore. Everything was so much focused on the oil, developing the oil industry and the oil business, that the reindeer herders were left alone, and they could preserve their local cultures and way of life quite undisturbed, I would say. But there was something that the Soviet Union was also guilty of, and that was the emergence of the so-called indigenous intelligentsia, which are educated people who got university degrees, who were meant to become teachers, who were meant to become doctors, who were meant to become so-called local intelligentsia. And they took up social and ecological problems and cultural problems also in the 80s during the perestroika time. And they were the first one to spoke out about these problems and demanded solutions, and demanded rights, and demanded compensation, and spoke about the decline of traditional forms of economy, about the problems, the ecological problems, and so often also the loss of language, which is a problem for a lot of local northern people all over the circumpolar Arctic region. What they called lumpenizatia in Russian, lumpenization, roughly translated, actually a term taken from Marxist ideology, the kind of the social decline of the lower classes. And that's something that they saw among their own people, with rising problems of alcoholism, suicide, health problems, etc. pp. And of course, the basis for that was also a very, a very drastic demographic change, because when at the beginning of the 20th century, the indigenous local Khanty population, and Mansi as well, made up to 80% of the population. Now it's 0.80%. So you can imagine from yourself feeling like at home at your land, you became just the tiny minority that became almost invisible in the 80s especially, and not appearing even in the public media a lot. And then the grade of urbanization. I showed you pictures of these big cities, like Surgut has something like 300, 400,000 inhabitants. Of course, also the indigenous population became very much urban. A lot of Khanti now live in these oil cities and not anymore on these reindeer herding camps that I showed you. But Nikolai already mentioned the legislation and the legal framework that these indigenous groups are nowadays embedded in. I will just shortly mention only that, of course, indigenous rights are guaranteed in the Russian constitution, which is very important. Then there's a special law on the indigenous people. We spoke about the kind of categories. And then there's a very important law, and this is the one that guarantees land rights actually of the indigenous population, something that is still a problem because, we cannot be sure how much we can speak really about rights to the land. It's not a kind of ownership, but it's called territories of traditional nature use. You have to keep in mind again this kind of term traditional, which appeared already several times, and how this can be defined. Actually, there's no way to define that. Is, for instance, a teacher teaching the indigenous language, is that a traditional form of nature use? Of course not. But these territories of traditional nature use and how they should be established is also defined in law. And then there's a policy framework for sustainable development, which defines the way that these territories have to develop and how that looks like in practice. In practice, in this actually area that I'm speaking about, and I don't speak about the other territories, not about Yakutia, not about Yamal. This is a very specific Khanty-Mansiyski autonomous district kind of way of dealing with the problem. Actually, every family is negotiating on their own with the oil company managers the agreements on their land and what they want to get from them and how much they should pay and what kind of infrastructure construction they give their agreement to and how that should be maybe changed. The plans of the oil company when they want to establish it becomes darker and darker. When they want to establish new infrastructure or a new road or a new drilling place, they have to go to negotiations. And here you see some of these reindeer herders with the oil company managers and some representatives of the local administration. What they get out of them are, for instance, flats in the city, so the children can visit a school, in this case Kogalem, because the schools and the oil companies in these oil cities are of more decent quality than the ones in the indigenous villages. They get an SUV, as in this case, so they can travel from the city to their forest settlement, but they are also wearing their traditional clothes because the times changed, and nowadays you get respect for, and of course you have to prove also that you are traditional. We spoke about the importance to prove actually that you are engaged in traditional nature use, and because this is invisible. I mean, what you are doing on the land, nobody sees. But if you wear such a clothing, everybody, of course, recognize immediately that you are traditional. I mean, no question. This must be traditional. You know, even if you look at maybe pictures from 100 years ago, maybe the clothing looked very different. But what you also get, for instance, are jobs for your children. In this case, some of the Khanty youth working on the oil field. And this is already a tricky issue because when these guys grow up, will they get the same rights as their parents? Because they are now oil workers, you know? Are they indigenous anymore at all? That's a big question. Of course, from their perspective, there's no question. They are Khanty, they are speaking the Khanty language, they have their Khanty settlement, they own even reindeer, and they are working in shift work. So they work 1 month and maybe they exchange with their brother the work with the reindeer herd. This is actually a picture of these roads that people can commute, and these are very ambivalent as well. You know, you can go with your SUV to the city and bring your children to school, but you see also how these roads are expanding and expanding because the snow and the rain is distributing the sand to the swamps. And soon, on one side, the water will be dammed and everything will be flooded. And on the other side, the water is kind of drying away. I mean, when the side going to the river, of course, is falling dry, and then all the trees and everything is drying out. Another effect, of course, of this proximity to the oil workers is also that you get new economic opportunities. You can sell your products, your meat. This is a picture of the day of the reindeer herd, and again you see this kind of demonstrated traditional way of life, because it's so important to be traditional. You have to dress in your beautiful traditional clothing to demonstrate to the outside world that this is really you have really the right to do this, and you have the right to sell the meat, and it's you are an indigenous person. But there are also new ways of making businesses. Of course, in former times, they were not selling the heads of the reindeer as souvenirs, but because the demand from this incoming population, that's a kind of new business to deal with. The other side of this relationship is what we call paternalism. It's a kind of attitude, a kind of positive attitude to the indigenous population, which is like looking down on them, exoticizing them. Like you see here, maybe in the picture, they are these kind of beautiful children of the nature that, of course, the state and the companies and the civilized world, I speak in brackets, of course, has to take care of. This is also something that, of course, is inherited from the Soviet times, where actually this kind of paternalism was directed toward the whole population, and goes back, of course, to pre-revolutionary times. That's the way how colonization always worked. It was not only extracting the resources, but also protecting people, but keeping them in a kind of lower situation. Yeah, kind of to summarize all these a little bit, and to say, to name a certain list of problems that remain is, of course, this situation does not solve the problem with the limitation of pasture lands and fishing grounds and hunting grounds. When in former times, reindeer herders always know that there's plenty of territory. If your land gets exhausted, you move away, you look for new territories. If you have a big family, you can send out your children. The oldest son would go away, the youngest son would stay with the parents. So there's no reserves anymore left. So people are quite limited to the places where they live. A second problem is, of course, you can negotiate about reindeer pastures. You can maybe reduce your reindeer herd, but when it comes to the sacred, to the religious places of veneration, to the places where people bring offerings to the spirits and to the gods, that's something that is not negotiable. But also, oil fields are not negotiable for the oil companies. And this is a huge, of course, issue of potential conflicts. A never-ending problem are dogs on the oil field. People love their pets, and they bring their pets wherever they want. And it's very hard to understand for oil workers that there should be no dogs on the oil fields. It's long forbidden already, decades, but still these dogs remain a potential for conflict, up to even homicide, I would say. There were cases that went to court because of the dogs, attacking, of course, the reindeer of the local people, and not only the reindeer. And then, one remaining problem is also that, of course, there are technologies available that make production more ecologically, so to speak, harmless, to avoid ecological damage and pollution, but they are cost intensive. And how to motivate companies to invest in these kind of technologies like horizontal drilling, for instance, that you don't have a lot of drilling places, but you have one drilling place from which you can reach different deposits. It's much more expensive. These are remaining problems. And to sum up in a way, but I will just, if I don't have time, how much time do we have still? I think I should come to an end. I don't know how much I will go through these points. I think I mentioned most of them already. So let's better move on, not to at least name some of the cases where actually this question of conflict or dialogue became very serious and very actual. One of them is the case of the sacred lake Numtor. That's a place where already in the 30s of the 20th century, a local uprising against the Soviet state happened, where local people were actually rising up and started to protest against the policy of the Soviet state at that time, which is quite far away from the local centers. It's at the border between Yamal and Khanty-Mansisk areas, and you see here the sacred island, which actually was forbidden to be walked on by local people. They just went there in order to pray and in order to do rituals and offerings at these sacred islands. But of course, already during the Soviet time, geologists found deposits there, and in the 2014-15, the local oil company Surgutneftegas actually wanted to develop these special place. There was a nature reserve, a natural park actually established at the same area. The problem with this natural park was that it was explained to the local population as a kind of protection. You know, if you have this kind of nature protective area, then everything will be fine. Nobody will disturb it anymore. What the local population was not understanding at that time when this natural park was established was also that if the oil companies come, if the oil company comes and want to develop an oil field there, it will be the natural park who will negotiate with the oil company, not the local reindeer herders anymore. So when this happened actually, and the local reindeer herders learned that actually the company is already planning a road and planning already drilling places, they went up, went to the press, made a lot of noise, and managed actually at least to get to force the company to make amendments, to think about compensation. And of course, they raised a lot of awareness. Still, what they didn't manage was to prevent the development of the road to their village and the development of actually the drilling places that the company established. Another case, again, a sacred place, again, a lake with an island, which is considered to be sacred by the local people. But here you see already it's surrounded by oil drilling places. But still, it's not so much the oil drilling places, which of course regularly also produce pollution. It's the recreational practices of the oil workers who want to go fishing to that lake, who go to the island and make fire on that island, which is not regulated because they move freely on their oil field in their free time. Of course, they take their private car, they go somewhere, and they don't even know what they are doing there. While around that lake, there are Reindeer Settlements, who and especially one of the local kind of inhabitants who is the custodian of that sacred place, who take actually care about that place and who also performs rituals there. Sergei Kechimov, he got notorious for protesting, and he was probably threatening also local oil workers, who then took him to court, and this court case went on from 15 to 17, when he actually was convicted of attempted murder, threatening the life of one of these one of these oil workers. But in order to avoid the conflict to really kind of expand, at the same time he was convicted, the local governor announced an amnesty. So the court case was timed exactly this way, so that he was convicted in order to kind of so the oil company and the oil workers would not lose their face, but he was released under the amnesty of the local governor on the 9th of May, the Victory Day in Russia. But still, this kind of conflict is not over. Some weeks ago, we read again that there were some protests going on. This is just a picture from this court case, which really went on for long, and it was a kind of not clear, because if he would be imprisoned and get into prison, that of course would have caused a lot of more local protest. But this is like, and I want to end with this slide and tell you that there's still quite a potential for conflict. This is actually a local member of the local parliament, of the local Duma, member of the ruling party of Russia, United Russia, Tatyana Gogoleva, a veteran, so to speak, of the indigenous movement, who already was in the member of the Duma in the 90s. And this is from her Instagram account, where she actually warns against the development of the policies of the oil companies going back to the Soviet times, when, how she frames it here, when the oil companies didn't want to listen to the people living in the taiga. So when to read such words from an official politician nowadays from the local parliament actually makes one think of really like now the pendulum is going a little bit more towards the side of conflict in the dialogue between local people and oil companies. And this is the case actually through all at least the post-Soviet time that I witnessed. It's always kind of swinging between these different sides. On the one side, local people using opportunities and finding ways to negotiate with the oil companies. On the other side, using the public, using all kinds of political instruments in order to say to the oil companies, we have our means to put pressure on you and to make you change your policies. How effective that is of course a question of research, but it's of course a question of life for these people. Thank you very much. I think there's still, that's announcement of the next lecture. But I think I have no idea about the time actually, because there was no time here.
We have 15 minutes for questions.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, of course we are ready to whatever questions appear. Any questions?
Questions can be in Russian.
Yeah, of course. we can even answer them at first. But I don't know. We don't know who's following us from the internet, because that was live streamed, right? Yeah. So there might you might answer them in English, I guess.
No questions. Great.
Yeah.
First part of the lecture that was about colonization and its interpretations, because we have very complex international situation, and what I heard in the beginning of lecture was about problematic interpretation of Russian colonization of Siberia. It may be interpreted not in the way that we are acquainted with. And I think that our territories in Siberia are under this new dangerous interpretations, and the rights of Russia for these territories and the rights of other interested sides.
No, of course, nobody questions the rights of Russia over the territory, the sovereignty, or the integrity of the country. That's not the question. What is, when I say that's the choice of the word, whether we call it annexation or colonization or developing or whatever, the choice is political. And the choice is ideological. And there are people who would routinely call it annexation. There are other groups who routinely call it development. Some people will say освоение. Some people in Russian, some people would say colonization. Some people would say оккупация even. It's just a question of different voices that you can hear about this issue, but nobody, of course, is questioning the rights of Russia over the land. If I got your question correctly. Thank you. Yes?
Yes, thank you so much for whole story about this very difficult question. And I'm wondering, I'm sure that in Canada it's the same story about people living high north and how Canadian policy is communicating with them. So can you make an example of something like the best practice how to deal with such difficult things?
Best practice, that's your cup of tea.
Thank you.
Of course, I mean, that's a difficult question because when you think about best practices, they should be always best in the context of the problem. And on one side, of course, we can say that there are commonalities between the situation of indigenous people in the Canadian North and indigenous people in the Russian North, but there are also striking differences. So at the end, the question is, of course, is there something to learn? And I think there's something to learn, of course, from both sides. Of course, the situation in the Canadian Arctic is very different from that in the Russian North. In Canada, indigenous people, especially in the Northern Territories, like we know about the establishment of Nunavut, which has its own local indigenous government and rights of self-government that go far beyond the political rights of indigenous people in Russia. How much that affects at the end the problems that we spoke about here, for instance, social problems like substance abuse, suicide, joblessness, life expectancy, etc., pp. When we see how that is affected, we see that there are different kind of issues involved as well, because they are not solved just by granting people sovereignty, political sovereignty. There should be other mechanisms attracted as well. But of course, indigenous people in Russia sometimes look to their Canadian brothers and sisters and say that we would like to have this kind of political autonomy that they reached. Then we can look to the Scandinavian North, where the Sami people are living in 4 different states: Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Russia, and how they manage in these different states to defend rights or to solve problems or to develop their own cultures or economies or sociality. So I'm very skeptical about these kind of establishing best practices for all these regions. I wouldn't say so. It's not possible. But of course, the acknowledgement of rights is something very basic. And these are not only political rights. These are, of course, also rights to the land, which is in all these territories. It's very important. And I have spoken shortly about that. It's cultural rights like linguistic rights, rights to have education in your languages, support for your languages, and also protection for your beliefs and for your religious practices. These are also important issues for the indigenous people. Yeah.
I just want to add that Canada, just like Russia, is very diverse. And if you take Nunavut, for instance, the degree of political autonomy is very high. But if you take Labrador, it's much more comparable in this respect to Russia, because the population of the so-called indigenous villages there is sometimes 20% indigenous, 30% indigenous, 40% indigenous. If it's half and half, it's a lot already. So the degree of political autonomy in Canada is also different for different indigenous groups. That's my comment on what you said.
Yeah, what is an important difference that we also learned in very specific in the relationship between companies and local people is that in Canada and in the US as well, these relationships are very formalized. This is all regulated by papers, by legal scholars, by if you are a tribe or if you are a local group, you need your legal advisor, and you have to make these agreements very correctly and very on paper and stick to every word. Here, as we see, the oil companies are ready to negotiate with single families. They have no lawyers. But on the other side, we also see that local oil managers have much more knowledge about, and they are approaching local people often much more on the same level because they're also hunters. They also go fishing, and they have much more understanding. And that's something very traditional Russian one. If you saw this picture from Surikov, where the local population and the Russian Cossacks were fighting with each other, they were quite on the same level. I mean, of course, the Cossacks had firearms, and the local people had only a bow and arrow. But from Surikov's way, both of them were wild, so to speak. So there's this kind of there's not this kind of cultural hierarchy. There's much more importance of informal, of all kinds of informal relations in Russia. We know that the informal economy was very important during the late Soviet time, and maybe even more important during the very early post-Soviet time. And this kind of tradition, we speak again of tradition, of informal relations is something very important in Russia, which is not the case in informal relations in the Canadian context, it would just be corruption. And that's, of course, something outside the legal framework. And I wouldn't call this corruption in Russia. Often these are very human relations between oil companies and specific people in the oil companies and the local people. Of course, there are power relations involved, and this is another issue, but that's something to do research on, I think.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions as well.